So welcome to Views from the Capitol Budget Edition. This is the time of year where we try to tell you what to expect. And joining me today is MSBO to help explain the numbers better than I can. We just got the budget Wednesday night. It was probably 4 o'clock when documents started leaking out and getting all those documents together, trying to review them all. We are still figuring things out. This budget is quite large compared to some of the years. There's a lot of things in it. So we may not be able to answer some of your very detailed questions, but we will do our best. So the bill it's Senate Bill 173. If you're interested in reading the whole long thing, it is a school bus bill. It includes schools, community colleges, and universities. So when you open it and it's 545 pages, only most of that is K-12. The bill has now been enrolled. It will be fly-specced by the legislative people and then presented to the governor. Once officially presented, she has 14 days to sign it. We do not expect many vetoes, if any at all. So we feel the information we're giving you today is solid. If you have questions as we go, please put them in the chat and we will answer them as we can. And then if you could stay muted, we would appreciate it. It cuts down on the background noise, makes it easier for everyone to hear the speakers. So before we really get started, I want to introduce MASB's GR staff. We are finally a fully staffed department again, which is very exciting for me. So first, I'd like to introduce Liz Cook. She has come on sort of in an administrative role to help me out as well as a couple other departments. And I'll let Liz tell you a little about herself.
Hi, I actually have just been here about 3 months, so I am still learning everything, but I'm excited to be here.
Thanks. And then Brenda Pilgrim is even newer. She started with us, I think it's 3 weeks ago now, and she is our new Assistant Director of Government Relations. Brenda, why don't you introduce yourself?
Hi, it's great to be here. I'm Brenda. This is the end of week 3, and I just recently came from as a staffer to a senator.
All right. And then I'd like to congratulate Bob Dewan on taking over as Executive Director of MSBO, and I will let him introduce his staff.
Well, thanks very much, Jen. And yeah, I'm not official yet, but tomorrow I will be. So this is my last day of being in a Deputy Executive Director position. So that's wonderful. I have with me today Jason Helson, who comes to us from Muskegon ISD. He came to MSBO back in February, and he and I have had some really excellent time together to get him up to speed on kind of how this side of the fence works and truly getting into the legislative side for us, including this budget. Jason's been the spearhead of this since it came out in the January-February timeline, and we can't be happier to have him here. So Jason, I'm gonna have you introduce yourself, and Jen, I just want to say to you and Don and the rest of your staff, thanks for always including us in this. It's been very good, not only for our members, but yours. And we certainly appreciate the collaboration that happens with our building. So thanks for all that. And I'll turn it over to Jason.
Well, thanks, Bob. Thanks, Jen. I'm really thrilled to be with you all today. My name is Jason Helson. I'm the Associate Executive Director at MSBO. As Bob mentioned, I joined MSBO in February as a 17-year school business official veteran and MSBO member. And it's been a lot of fun and a little bit of a whirlwind jumping right into this budget season. And I'm thrilled to be with you today. Don't quite often get a chance to talk with school board members, and I imagine that's a large portion of our audience today. We may have a few school business officials peppered throughout our list as I shared this link with our membership multiple times this week. I know everybody's chomping at the bit to get into the budget. As Jen mentioned, we haven't had it for long, and there is a lot of detail here to go through. So we'll certainly do our best. What I'm hoping to do today is to share a high-level overview with you, hit some of the main points, and we'll do our best to answer any questions. But there certainly are some sections here in this budget that I'm not yet familiar with or able to speak about on an expert level by all means. So we'll do our best, and without further ado, I'll jump into it. any discussion of school aid fund and state aid, from my perspective, always starts with our foundation allowance, which is our per pupil fund from the state. That's always a key measure of how are we doing? Is there an increase? And what we're seeing with this conference committee is a 5% increase. And of course, that's where Governor Whitmer started the executive budget recommendation back in February. The House and the Senate took a little bit different approaches to that throughout the budget process, but ultimately they settled in the middle. And so what that looks like is the target foundation allowance moves from $9,150 per student up to $9,608, or a $458 per pupil increase. So this is very similar to what we experienced last year. That 5% increase carried forward from last year's budget. We heard a lot of discussion this year about cyber schools and would they be cut to the 80% level. That was an idea that was introduced. Ultimately, that did not come to fruition. However, there is no increase for 100% online cyber schools. So that would be flat at the $9,150 per student level. And we see the introduction of something new, which is section 29 called enrollment stabilization. And this is really an idea that came forward in the House budget proposal in trying to help declining enrollment districts. And so what section 29 is going to do is provide a 2-year blend, a 50-50 blend of the 2-year blended counts, the prior year and the current year. And any district with a declining enrollment would get some funding through this new section 29. And that enrollment stabilization fund is established through the fiscal year 22-23 supplemental. And that's probably, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention, there is a significant component to this budget process where there are some supplemental dollars of the current fiscal year appropriated to get to some of these goals and to also save for the future in some key areas. And we'll try to hit on those as we move further along. MIPSers is one of my favorite topics to talk about. MIPSers, of course, is our pension system, Michigan Public School Employee Retirement System, excuse me. And we see section 147 come into play pretty significantly. There's some significant dollars once again appropriated through section 147. One key thing to note is in this current fiscal year, 22-23, we had a $1 billion allocation through section 147C2 for one-time payments into the retirement system. And that is removed from the 23-24 budget. And so I think that's, while that does do some good in terms of paying that debt down in our pension system, I think that's probably a relief, as there were many accounting and GASB accounting treatment questions that arose through that process. One of the interesting things that's been brought up again and again, but it comes to fruition the first time, is intermediate school districts, or ISDs, are now included in section 147A. And it is tagged as one-time funds, but that's about $12 million to now include ISDs there. Section 147A2 is pretty significant, and it does increase significantly in this budget cycle. Part of what the state is planning to do and hopes to do is to accelerate the reduction in the payroll growth assumption. And that's a mouthful, but basically we're making more conservative assumptions as we go along with our pension system and bringing that payroll growth assumption down to 0.75%, according to my notes. And then finally, we see the introduction of section 147F. So we're all the way up A, B, C, D, E, and now F. And we see that the state will reimburse districts for the equivalent of 0.5% of their 20.96% of payroll obligation through section 147F. We expect that this will be a similar approach to how 147A works. And what I mean by that is the state will send the district money and the district keeps it as operating funds rather than paying it back as a pension contribution. Special education, section 51 and 51E especially, got a lot of attention through this budget negotiation process. In the end, we are moving to 100% of special education foundation allowance. And this is intent language that was introduced in last year's budget cycle. But when the governor introduced her executive recommendation, it stopped short of funding at that 100% level. So this is a good thing for both local ISDs, local districts and ISDs alike, excuse me. I probably don't have to tell you, but a lot of districts have special education obligations and cost obligations that far exceed the state and federal funds that come in to fund those obligations. And so we would expect that this would not only bolster special education programs, but also help out a lot of districts' general funds with that unfunded or underfunded special education obligation. You might hear a term called maintenance of effort, or MOE, and that's a topic that has come up again and again in these discussions, and certainly some debates about whether or not this puts districts in a difficult position. We had several meetings throughout the spring, including the state budget office, and I can tell you from my perspective, and being at both a local district for 13 plus years and an ISD for about 4 years, I don't see that as a huge concern. I think districts are going to be in great shape with this moving forward, and this will be a positive thing. At risk through state section 31A is another big source of revenue for local districts. And we see a significant investment here. We see an increase of about $205 million. And for years and years, there was a target for at risk of 11.5% of the foundation allowance for economically disadvantaged students, essentially. And for many, many years, there was not enough money appropriated into Section 31A to pay that obligation. And so there was a proration factor. In the current fiscal year, 22-23, there was finally enough money appropriated where that proration factor was taken off. So that was a big win for programs for needy and disadvantaged students and districts with a high poverty percentage, especially. The School Finance Research Collaborative, through that process, set a target that said 35% should be the goal, not 11.5%. And the House and the Senate both took different approaches through the budget cycle, but really leaned into that recommendation. And what we see in this final budget is there's going to be something called an opportunity index to provide weighted funding to districts, depending on a number of factors. That target range is going to be between 35 and 47%. Now, I mentioned there's $205 million additional invested in this fund. That's not nearly enough to get to that 35 to 47%. So now we're once again talking about a proration factor, but it is going to be an increase compared to what we're seeing in the 22-23 budget cycle. So districts will receive between 11.5 and 15.3% of foundation allowance, depending again on those district factors. And I would say based on those lofty targets, keep an eye on this in future budget cycles, as that's a sure signal to me that this will be a priority in the near future for future funding. Food service got a lot of attention throughout the budget process. We've all lived through the pandemic, and we went to kind of almost overnight free universal meals through a lot of USDA flexibility and eligibility expansion. And of course, that was taken away now with the 22-23 school year. We will be going back to universal free breakfast and lunch through Section 30D in the state budget. That's about 160 million statewide. And so an important note about this, the state's fiscal year, of course, starts October 1st, which raises the question, are we going to start the year with paid meals and then move to free meals? The answer there is we expect not, because the state has included a 22-23 supplemental, which should cover the beginning of the 23-24 school year. And I think this is probably one area that Jen will talk a little bit more about later. GSRP for pre-K section 32D especially, but there are multiple subsections here within the budget. Expansion of pre-K opportunities, trying to get to universal pre-K opportunities has been a center point of the governor's talks, especially back to the state of the state in January 2023. And this certainly comes through in the GSRP sections of this budget. The per child allocation is increased to $9,608 per student. And that's in line with the foundation allowance, of course. That follows the path of the past several years after many years where we had stagnated funding through GSRP and it wasn't keeping up. There are increases to the eligibility thresholds according to the executive recommendation, which goes to 300% of the federal poverty level. And there are several other possibly significant funding streams available for expansion of GSRP, including a 5-day pilot option, which would fund students at an additional 20% weight for 5 days a week. Expanded transportation funding and new classroom startup grants are other options under the GSRP umbrella. Two sections that are,
Jason?
yeah, of course.
Before you move on, there's a couple questions that go back to some things you already mentioned. One is the enrollment blend. Is it still 90 fall and 10 spring to calculate current and prior year?
Yes, that is my understanding, that you would take, essentially, you do your 23-24 blend on the 90-10, and that would be weighted at 50%. And then you take your 22-23 blend at the 90-10, and that would be weighted at 50%, and you would combine the two.
And then with MIPSers and ORS issuing new rates this week, they were much higher than the prior year. Is the increase we see in MIPSers high enough to cover the increase in rates?
Excellent question. And like a lot of things, I think the answer is it depends. We've had discussions with the budget office that suggests that normal rate increase, that normal cost increase that we're seeing through those rates is intended to be covered by the increase in the section 147A2 fund. And so there was about 166 million in prior year or in prior budget projections. And I believe we ended up somewhere very similar to that with the conference committee. I'll try to look up the exact number here as we're talking. But the intent really is that the normal cost increase that you're going to experience by going to the 31.34%, for example, on basic MIP with premium subsidy, which was the biggest increase, 3.11% of payroll, should be offset by your district's 147A2 allocation. There's a lot of factors that go into that, including the statewide payroll, and those factors tend to lag behind a little bit. So your school business office is going to have to keep a close eye on those allocations as we get into the fall. Usually they'll start to show up in November, state aid, and you should get some sense at that point of, is it coming in where you expect it to be? I don't believe we have district by district allocations for that just yet, but that is a question that I've gotten multiple times. I hope that helps. I know it doesn't completely answer the question. All right. Well, I'll continue on. There's two other sections that are seen as part of the weighted funding model that we saw within the executive budget recommendation back in February. Those would be isolated districts for section 22D. That's increased by $2.2 million ongoing and $1.8 million of one-time funds. And bilingual education for section 41 is increased by 13.3 million in this conference committee. And I would say both of those increases go above and beyond the straight 5% increase originally proposed by the governor's executive budget recommendation. So again, if I'm trying to interpret this, read the tea leaves, I see the House and the Senate leaning in a little bit more on that weighted funding model and some of those recommendations that potentially came out of the School Finance Research Collaborative report several years ago. A few other things I would highlight as ongoing that see some increases. ISD mental health, section 31N. These grants started back in the 18-19 fiscal year, and I see that increased by $24.4 million. And so some ISDs have started their own programs. Some have flowed money through to locals, but we see another investment there. Early on for Section 54D, we see that straight 5% increase that follows the foundation allowance. ISD general operations for Section 81, we see the same 5% increase over your 22-23 allocation. Mental health grant for Section 31AA. This is tagged as one-time funds, but this was a funding stream that of course came through in the current fiscal year, 2022-2023. We see one-time funding of $328 million for mental health and school safety. And of course, this is a continuation of funds that were marked as one-time funds, something we've become accustomed to certainly over the years when there are resources available to continue those efforts. A few new sections that I would note as key for either increased or one-time funds. School
Jason,
service can, yeah,
Before the new section, before the
Yeah,
new section
absolutely.
on the safety and mental health grants, the question
Yes.
is that it's all one pot, but are the costs, the allowable costs the same?
that's an excellent question. I believe so, but I haven't dug into the details to know that for sure. I did see, I believe Section 97 was stricken, that was one-time funds from last year that did not carry forward into next year's budget. And so again, my assumption is that we're going to combine those pots of money and those allowable uses, but we'll try to follow up with a little bit better information there.
Yeah, the only thing that stuck out to me is it does say that 50% of those funds have to be used for mental health,
Absolutely.
but I haven't read the language in detail yet either.
I did see that tag. Be nice to know on the mental health funds if we can use those for current staffing. You know, I did ask that question of MDE earlier this spring. You know, is there a supplement versus supplant consideration? Technically, there is not. Their recommendation is use those for supplemental services, for supplemental staffing if you're hiring staff. But there is not that strong supplement versus supplant line that we're used to seeing with some of our federal funds. Some new areas that I would just highlight quickly. Service consolidation grants, Section 12C. I see $245 million there to study both consolidating services as well as physical consolidation. And so that's a big dollar ticket and a topic that we haven't talked about a ton in recent years. And so that's popping back up. Student loan repayment for Section 27K. We know this was a priority of the Senate, that they've been really hammering on staffing shortages and how do we attract new staff and retain current staff. And so one of the ways that we see that addressed is $225 million for districts to repay loans of employees who work directly with students. Certainly, I think there's going to be some questions about that as we move forward. Early literacy instruction in Section 35J, see $140 million appropriated in one-time funds. Transportation, I think I saw this in the chat earlier. Section 22L is introduced and provides $125 million from the newly created school transportation fund, which is established in the 22-23 supplemental appropriation. And that's appropriated to districts based on a formula which includes riders per square mile. And so we heard this in testimony this spring about some of the unique needs of rural and isolated districts, especially in northern Michigan. And so we see this as part of how this is addressed in the budget. Educator compensation program, Section 27L. So we see a one-time fund of $63.8 million for equal per pupil, payments to districts to increase educator compensation. Again, I think there's going to be some questions on what does this mean? Are we using one-time funds that are going to add to ongoing costs, such as a collective bargaining teacher compensation scale, but certainly more to come. And then one of the boilerplate languages, let me see, sorry, I'm trying to keep an eye on the chat without getting distracted. And I think I'm gonna,
I got you.
Bob or Jen might have some thoughts on those, so I'm gonna skip over that for a second. And then one boilerplate language change. I know Jen's gonna get into some of the language, but especially for my school business official friends out there, section 19 really stands out, state and federal reporting requirements. The way I read this essentially requires a rep style report every 30 days. So where reporting of staffing changes and personnel vacancies are required to be reported to the state within 30 days of changes in employment or assignment status. And I know that can be a bit of an administrative burden just happening twice a year. And so I worry a little bit about what is that going to mean for district central offices and business offices. One of the answers that we got throughout the budget process was trying to get a better picture of what the staffing picture really looks like statewide, and how do you get some details on that. Certainly you try to get better information, but you know, we always worry about unfunded mandates and administrative loads and all that sort of stuff. So definitely some concern there. Finally, I would wrap up with that supplemental fiscal year 22-23 appropriation makes several what I would call deposits into essentially sub funds of the school aid fund, and it establishes multiple funds that we haven't seen before. Things like the school transportation fund, the enrollment stabilization fund, the school meals reserve fund, the GSRP reserve fund, and the school aid fund rainy day fund, the school aid rainy day fund, excuse me. And we see this as likely a way of appropriating some of our current year funds in the next budget cycle, and also earmarking or saving some of those funds for specific purposes moving forward. I haven't seen this level of detail or deposit before, so I can't tell you exactly what that means, but it is pretty significant dollars. When we add those up, it gets close to $2 billion. And of course, we started this budget cycle talking about a $4 billion school aid fund balance, and how is that going to play out? We haven't seen balance sheets yet from House Fiscal Agency or Senate Fiscal Agency, but that's certainly one of the next steps or next questions for me in terms of understanding this big picture with the school aid fund budget and how it's going to play out for fiscal year 23-24. That kind of concludes my high level list. I know there are many one-time or what I would call special purpose funds or categoricals through this. We've talked about with school business officials throughout the spring, with this environment, with a big beginning fund balance, with some one-time funds, with some federal funds coming due. It's a perfect environment to see expanded categorical funds and categorical sources come through the budget, and certainly we're seeing that. And it's going to take a little bit to sort through those. We go to the MDE to say, what does this application look like? Who's going to be eligible for this source? In some cases, these are very special purpose where they're identified for one district, but in other cases, it might be a competitive grant or a per pupil grant that is new, that we're going to need a little bit of time to sort through them. So at this point, I will certainly try to answer any questions, but I'll kick it back to Jen, and I really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you and be with you today.
All right, before I get started, there are a couple questions that I think you can probably answer better than me. And if I'm not reading your question right now, it's because I think I might answer it as I talk in a minute. But Jason, is it correct that you cannot pay for a district employed social worker with 31 AA money?
I'm not certain on that one. That's an excellent question. Having not dealt directly with 31 AA myself, I'm not 100% confident in that just yet. I'll try to get you an answer here quickly.
And then I know there's some My Kids Back on Track money in there. I'm forgetting the section number, 23G.
Correct.
You have info on that, the supplemental funds?
Yes, I believe they took the matching component either down or off that we were concerned about. We did see a reduction in what was originally introduced, I believe, as a $300 million appropriation. And let's see, that is going to go to $150 million in the conference committee. It is part of the supplemental, which means theoretically it could flow out earlier. It is looking at an equal amount per pupil for students not proficient in math or reading. And I'm looking for that match language to see if I understood that correctly.
I think the match language was removed.
The match language was removed. It is not included in the conference committee. Absolutely. So instead of 300 million, 150 million, we're looking at per pupil for students not proficient in math or reading.
All right, one other question I saw in there was on the loan repayment, who would be responsible for paying that? And as I look at the language, the money flows to the district and the district figures out who qualifies. So it does look like it'll be on the district to have to facilitate that funding.
If I
There's
may, I
another
did.
question. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry. I did tune into one of the committee testimonies on that, and I believe the answer that was given there was that this becomes a taxable event to the teacher and would flow through payroll and be put on the W-2. Certainly, somebody who's more of a tax expert than me should weigh in on that, but that was, I think, the initial answer given there.
All right, I'm gonna touch on a few things that MASB was involved in working on, and I see this will hopefully answer some of the questions you have in the chat. But there were some pretty big things that we had been asking for and working toward, and we saw reflected in the budget. Maybe not exactly as we had hoped, but definitely steps in the right direction. I mean, Jason talked about moving toward that more weighted formula with at-risk and ELL and special education. But in digging down, one of the things we had asked for was a rolling blended count for the per pupil foundation. We knew that something like that would help our declining enrollment districts. The question was, would it hurt growing districts? And so where you see them landing on that is having the regular per pupil, but then creating that enrollment stabilization piece, which is your declining enrollment. If you had less enrollment this year than last year, you get to use that blended formula that Jason talked about in order to get some additional funds to help offset the loss of revenue. So we were really excited to see that happen. We know that most districts in Michigan are declining because Michigan's population is declining, our birth rate is declining, and that's nothing that anyone can do unless all of you wanted to go out and have more babies. So the declining enrollment piece will be very helpful for so many districts. Transportation was another one. When we went around to do our priority setting, this came up everywhere we went, really in the rural areas, but even in some of the suburban areas where you might have part of your population is really close together and some of it is more rural and spread out. So to see an actual transportation categorical come back is very exciting. The formula has not yet been set. It states that the department will assign each district to a quartile based on riders per square mile. And then they will take the average cost of that quartile, and that's what you'll get per pupil in that quartile you're in. So MDE has to make up a complicated formula for you first, and then you'll find out how much you're getting per pupil, and you'll be able to plan. But we don't have that at this point. When the House put this in originally, they did already establish those cutoffs for how many riders per square mile. They took that out in conference, so we have to wait for MDE to determine that. And then finally, the universal meals. This was another one that we were really happy to see. It is a priority of MASB's to have universal meals for all. We were focused on the feds. And for those of you that went out to DC with us in January, we had a meeting with Senator Stabenow. She was not very hopeful that we would get the USDA to extend that waiver again. But then we came home and the governor surprised us by putting it in her budget. There was no pushback as we worked this. In all of the meetings, I had 2 people in all of the meetings we had say, I don't think that's what we should do. Everyone else we met with, both sides of the aisle, saw the benefits of the universal meals. The one piece we were worried about was that in order to qualify for the universal meals, you have to have your debt paid off. And we were worried about timing, but they fixed that by putting the debt repayment to reimburse you for the debt you have to offset into the supplemental. So that money should flow before the October 1. That money should flow quickly. It will go into effect as soon as the budget is signed. And then, as Jason mentioned, so will meals so that they can start with your first day of school. So the goal is, if both of these things take immediate effect, your debt can be offset so you're all in the clear and you qualify for the meals. And then you can start meals your first day of school. And then October 1, we get the ongoing language that will provide for breakfast and lunch for all students. One of the questions was, do you have to offer these things in order to qualify for funding for universal meals? The way that it was written, and I need to double check the details, is that it's a submission. So how many meals did you provide? How many kids took advantage? We're going to turn all that back into MDE to help them with budgeting purposes. The things that you have to do is that you have to still receive your federal funding, and your state funding is offset by that. So you still get all your federal funding for the meals, and then your state funding will be on top of it to cover the whole cost. You also have to continue to strongly encourage your families to fill out the free and reduced lunch form. This is going to be the big sticking point. And this is something we're going to be working on as we go forward. But for now, let's celebrate the universal meals, and we'll talk about that in our next one. But you will still be encouraged to have families fill that out. Your economically disadvantaged count for at-risk funding is based on those forms. So it is still important. And then the third thing was that you had to have your debt forgiven. So forgive your debt with the money that'll be coming with immediate effect, and you should be able to run your universal meals program for all of your kids. That was one we were really excited about. We're not backing down on the feds. It would be great if the feds would do it and the feds would pay for it. But Michigan now joins, I want to say 5 or 6 other states that are offering universal meals to their kids over the next year or so. One of the other things we're keeping an eye on is the FAFSA challenge. And this is where we'd like it to stay. So the governor and the universities, the community colleges, they are really big on FAFSA being filled out. We keep hearing these rumors of legislation to require the FAFSA to be completed to graduate. We're strongly opposed to that idea. So one step in trying to get the FAFSA filled out by more students is this FAFSA challenge. So a district will receive $50 per pupil for anyone who fills out the FAFSA by May 1st of 2024. Then if there's money left in this line item, they will reopen it for anyone who finishes it by June 30th, 2024. And then districts are encouraged to take this $50 per pupil and use it in FAFSA completion assistance or information, however they see fit to entice families and students to push their families to fill this out. It did include language that said you could give $50 gift cards to students, which I know some districts did last year, including mine, because I didn't fill it out in time. My kid didn't get a gift card, and you can bet I hear about it. But they removed that language, so that is not an allowable expense anymore. There are some sections that we have been working on repealing that did actually get repealed. Unfortunately, 152B is not one of them. That is the money for private schools. That money will continue at $1 million for private schools for things that do not affect instruction. So they're talking about fire drills and things like that, that they're allowed to pay for. That was a court case we lost. We fought for many, many years. We had hope with the Democratic majorities in both houses and the governor's office, we would get rid of it. I'm pretty convinced it was a bargaining chip and it's back in at $1 million. But they do repeal two sections that were always sort of weird in the budget. One that said you cannot use state money to sue the state. That was always one that we never figured out how they could enforce and figure out which dime you spent was state and which was local. That's repealed, as well as the section that says that you cannot have merit pay, or no, must have merit pay included, but your collective law says you can't bargain merit pay. So it was the circular, do you violate the school aid code or do you violate para? That's gone. Now you have just one law to follow instead of figuring out which one sounded better to violate. Electric buses, there is a section in here for electric buses. It's section 74B. It's 125 million for districts to convert or replace current school buses to electric or alternate fuel buses, and also allows you to spend that money on infrastructure. That is completely separate from the transportation categorical that is per pupil for the miles you're driving on whatever kind of bus you're driving. This is a separate thing to try to help districts move toward electric buses if they so choose. Let's see. What is considered a cyber school? There's cyber charters by definition. So it's your K-12 inks and things like that. And I apologize, I don't know what a CVEP program is. I'm hoping Jason or Bob does, a CVEP program. I don't know if this affects it because I'm not quite sure what that is. So I'm going to look to Jason and Bob and see if one of them know.
I sure don't. Sorry.
All right, we'll have to track that question down. Universal meals impact districts that are already doing that. It's the same. All this will do is if you are paying above the federal amount that you're getting from the feds for breakfast and lunch, if you are paying above that, that's where the state steps in. So if you are already fully covered by federal money, then you won't need the state money. But if you're not, and you've got that gap, that's where the state steps in to make sure that no one is using their operating dollars on meals. I
Jen.
see the question about the rainy, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry to cut in. CVEP is the KPAC Virtual Education Program, which is a local online education program dedicated to student success. My understanding is those would not be impacted if they're locally run, but I think you have to be careful of where there's that distinction and understand that very carefully for your individual district circumstances. So.
Thanks. It looks like that's about the end of our questions. As Jason mentioned, there's a long list of individual categoricals for one-time funding and special projects. We made an executive decision at the beginning that we could spend the whole hour talking about those. So if you have individual questions, please let us know. But there's a lot. There's more than we have seen in the past. And my guess is some of that has to do with the fact that the infrastructure funding is not available yet, but that's just a guess. The infrastructure funding will be available once the infrastructure study is done. They did put more money into that fund again this year, but it is all locked in that fund until the study is done. Once the study is done, MDE will have a grant process in order to access that money. I know for some of you, this has been a big frustration. I've talked to you, I've heard from you. I know and I understand. We asked the governor's office when the budget came out, could we change it to, as the study, like, I agree to participate in the study or something to loosen that tie on it. And they want to make sure that they get everything done, all of the study completed before they start opening up that fund. So we tried to get it opened earlier. It's not gonna happen. So hopefully this year we will see that. The study is supposed to be underway as we speak. I don't know how long it will take. These are questions that I don't think anybody can answer, but we know it's a frustration and we would like that money to be open as well. That was one thing that we were so excited about last year, because Michigan is one of only 7 states that doesn't support school infrastructure. And here we were supporting school infrastructure, but it's a hurry up and wait. So hopefully we'll have that money available to you this year. The general feeling on the school aid budget, we were pretty pleased. I will admit the day it came out wasn't necessarily an all good day, but this was a bright spot in the day. I am optimistic that some of the changes they're making will stick. We do need to be cautiously optimistic, because we will see funds start to fall off. The changes they made to the tax policy this year, we're protected from. And that is because of how they did it. And all of the work you have supported MASB and the other groups on to make sure they understand that tax policy changes affect our schools. So when they repealed the pension tax, they changed the formula for how much the school aid fund gets out of the income tax. And they increased the percentage that we receive in order to cover for the money we would probably lose under the pension tax. That not only will cover the money out of the pension tax, and is actually a solid way to do it, but with this 1-year rollback on our income tax rate, the formula is set up in such a way that the school aid fund contribution remains flat. And the general fund will take the hit from the loss of funds, not the school aid fund. Now, that's not 100% good news, because we know there is still, I think it's almost $1 billion that rolls out for community colleges and higher education. And when the general fund is stressed, we become the savior. But it's a step in the right direction to truly do it right. So those cuts are not affecting our balance sheet. The question is, how is the economy going to settle down after all of the stuff from the pandemic? So these are conversations we'll still have, but I think there are structural changes within this budget that we will see carried forward. And that is hopeful, to be able to see us to take more of those steps toward the School Finance Research Collaborative at a time we can. So we're hopeful, but always cautiously. You guys know me, I'm never optimistic. So this is as close as I get. Are there any other questions before I switch topics just briefly before we wrap up today?
I think we're in good shape with the chat.
Okay. So I know you came here for budget information, but I would be remiss if we didn't talk about the elephant in the room, for my members especially. The package of para bills that were removing prohibited subjects of bargaining and changing all sorts of things, they are on their way to the governor. We delayed, that was the best we could do. We frustrated, we talked, we tried, we were unsuccessful. We did our best. We also sort of knew we were going to lose. We just didn't want to lose this badly. So on Wednesday, just before they passed the budget, the Senate passed the para package, which is 4354 through 57, 4044, and 4820. In these bills, thank you to all of you who responded to our alerts. We had well over 200 people respond to those alerts, and that is so helpful. It is part of what caused some people to think twice. At the end of the day, we weren't going to be able to beat the idea that the unions want this fixed. So despite our efforts, they passed as is. 4354 will put teacher placement, discipline and discharge, and layoff and recall back on the table, along with a handful of other things. But those are the big 3 we were focusing on. It will also, for all local governments, and our local government friends got involved with us, it will put intergovernmental agreements back on the table. And then it also puts privatization of non-instructional services back on the table. But the three we were really worried about were placement, layoff and recall, and discipline and discharge. The other piece of this was 4044, which says if your contract expires, current law says if your contract expires, step increases and healthcare do not go into effect. They would freeze where they are. This repeals that law. So now if your contract expires, step increases will still go into effect even without the contract. We had opposed this on its own, but then added to removing the items from collective, from the prohibited subjects of bargaining. That may push a lot more contracts toward impasse and toward expiration. And so it became an even bigger concern. And then the last bill, 4820, is, I'm still trying to figure out exactly what it does. They subbed it at the last minute on Wednesday night. But the idea behind it was to ensure that we wouldn't have seniority-based systems for layoff and recall and teacher placement. But in doing that, it guts part of the layoff and recall law, getting rid of all of the BB factors and saying there are only 3 factors to consider: length of service in your grade level or subject area, special training, and one more. And disciplinary record. Those are the only 3 that can be considered for teacher placement and for layoff and recall. So while they were trying to make it better to say you can't have a seniority-based system, they managed to create a whole other mess around layoff and recall. That bill especially, it was introduced at the last minute. It was a mess. They did amend it to make it a little better, but it is, I have sent it to Brad Banasic to figure out. That is definitely one that deserved more time to figure out before it went forward. The implementation date for the labor changes, it is 90 days after sine die. At this point, we don't know when sine die will be, so I would say they'll go into effect in February or March. If they're traditional sine die, it'll be the end of December, which means the end of March. We're hearing rumors they may do that sooner, more like Thanksgiving, which would push the 90 days into February. So we don't have a date, but know it's coming. And I am sure as I sit here and go through all the budget stuff, Brad and Dan on our team are doing the same through all these para changes, and we'll have more information for you. And yes, I will put the para list of bills in the chat. We have submitted throughout the process, if you're watching News in the Capitol, we have submitted memos in opposition to all of these bills to the various committees, to the Senate and House floor, and we are in the process of putting together a veto letter. Again, I do not have hope that any of these will be vetoed, but we want to make the point, and we want to be consistent, and we want to represent what many of you have told me, what most of you have told me is important. So that's happening. Sorry, we did what we could. Other than that, are there any other questions you have for us before we wrap up today? Anything else that you're hearing about? The legislature's gone for the summer. They're scheduled for July. We don't know if they'll actually meet. They're both scheduled in July for just 3 days. We don't know if that's real. We're kind of hopeful it's not. And we can get some downtime here because these last 6 months have been crazy. The retiree law change, great question, Linda. Yes, this happened this week as well. Came out of committee on Tuesday, was passed by the House on Wednesday. This changes the timeline for coming back. And again, we're trying to work out the details, and we think there might still be changes in the Senate. As it sits right now, it says that if you go back right after, let me start over. Current law says you have to sit out for 9 months after you retire before you can return to work without penalty to your pension. This changes it to say, if you go back in those first 9 months, you have a cap of $1,000 per calendar year that you can make without impacting your retirement. After that 9-month window is over, you are back to being able to substitute or help out or wherever the case may be, without a cap on your income. It passed the House pretty overwhelmingly. It is in the Senate. We're still hearing rumbles that there's still some things to tweak and play with, and the cap may change. But we're in the process of trying to get that changed so that we no longer have a strict 9-month sit out. That is something we never wanted to begin with. 9 months was too long. Yes, the cap amount, if you return in those 9 months under the bill, not under current law, under the bill would be $10,000 per year. And then under current law, you can't work at all in those 9 months or you lose your pension. So we're still working on that. We know that's a big deal to a lot of districts. We had hoped it would move faster, but there has been so much going on that quite honestly, the bill drafters, which is an amazing group of nonpartisan people that draft everything we do, have been completely overwhelmed as well. And that slows down a lot of the process for some of these bills. So we've been talking about introducing and running this retirement bill for months. We finally got, the bill sponsor finally got the bill a few weeks ago and was finally able to run it. So we're working with Representative Colazar on that. We do expect a good reception in the Senate. It's just a matter of when the Senate meets next. Are we going to talk about it over the summer? Are we going to talk about it in September? So we're working on it, probably not as fast as people would like. Thank you all for being here today. If you have other questions when this is over, feel free to contact myself or Jason. Be happy to track things down for you. We did record this and it will be available later today. For those of you on our News from the Capitol list, it will be in there so you can watch that link, share it with your colleagues that haven't seen it, or when you get bored or need to fall asleep, you can watch it again. So thank you all for being here. Thank you for your advocacy too. We always appreciate when you can back up the work that we're doing down at the Capitol.